Okay, we're going to start the panel now. I hope you can hear you. My voice isn't quite fully back, but it's almost there. We're going to change the order. We're going to change the order. Dick Lowe is going to speak first. There'll be 3 20-minute presentations. Meng will speak second, and I'll speak third. First two are put together, especially because they're even closer related topically than mine. They're talking very concretely about China, whereas mine will be talking about a theoretical issue of the question of markets and socialism. So with that, you can see Dick Lowe. This is Dick Lowe. That's the topic there. The political economy of China, new normal. So, Dick Lowe.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So what I want to talk about is what the still ongoing process of the evolution of the Chinese economy, known as the new normal. Of course, we have learned over the past weeks of all the, once again, we are witnessing the resurgence of the so-called China collapse story, like hitting the headlines of the newspapers about the ongoing economic crisis in China. But that is not new at all. The same story has been coming and going all the times over the past 40 years. But nevertheless, it is still important to note of important characteristic of the Chinese economy this time around, that after the pandemic, now China seems to be going back, the same trends of development seems to be resuming. That is the continuous slowing down of economic growth since roughly 10 years ago, 2012 or 2013, and thereafter growth rate has been falling and falling. Right? So the pandemic was just a kind of interruption that accidentally pushing the economic growth up and down, but then the long-term trend resumes once again. And it is clear enough that the immediate cause of the growth slowdowns, the long-term trend, right, is the slowdown of growth of productive investments. That is a very clear sign. Right? That's of course conceptually the productive investment is the source of the expansion of the productive capacity as well as technological progress of the economy. Therefore, investment stagnation tends to slow down the economic growth. And also bearing in mind that China stands in contrast to the rest of the world over the past 40 years, that on the one hand, China's economic growth has been much faster than the rest of the world. The rough calculation from the World Development Indicators is that over the past 40 years, roughly 1980 up until 2021, that China's economic growth on average 8.5% a year. The rest of the developing world, roughly 1.3%. And similarly for the advanced countries. And then in the meantime, China's productive investment has been growing much faster, so much so that investment at a rate of GDP, roughly 40% or so on average, right, for China, whereas the rest of the developing world, roughly 25%. And China's represents a substantial increase over the previous decades, the golden age of capitalism, whereas both in the advanced countries and the developing world outside China, the investment rate has witnessed substantial decline over the era of globalization. So these are the stylized facts worldwide, which help to establish the arguments that investments is a productive investment is the immediate determinant of the economic growth performance. And now China seems to be following the footsteps of the rest of the world with the declining rate of productive growth in productive investments, right? You can see that this curve in red is the growth of the economy, GDP in real terms, and the blue curve is investment growth in real terms. You can see before the reform, before the new normal, that is before the 2011 or so, the violent fluctuations, but nevertheless, on average, it was quite high rates of growth. And since some 10 years ago, we can see the continuous decline of the trend of investment. And this has been mainly largely accounted for by non-state investment or private investments. Nowadays, non-state investment or private investment accounting for about 2/3 of total investment in China. And you can see that the non-state, that is the dotted curve, early on from 2011 or so, all the way going down. In contrast to the ups and downs of state investment somehow try to be counter-cyclical, so try to pop up investment, but nevertheless, along with in the context of the market transformation of the Chinese economy as a whole, state investment is constrained by the weakness of public finance, in particular local government financing that has been encountered fundamental difficulties, and therefore the capability of state investment to pop up to sustain overall investment growth has been limited. And in this context, we need to know what have accounted for the slowdown of, or indeed in stagnation of the growth of productive investments. Now there are quite many different explanations, and by and large, we can identify two groups of explanations. One concerning the demand side, meaning the systematic insufficiency in demands, and another concerning the decline in profitability, given the fact that non-state investment, which is normally sensitive to the profitability, that it has become the main part of the Chinese investment, therefore profitability decline could be a cause of the investment stagnation. But then looking deeper, we notice that there are multiple causes of multiple explanations of declining profit rates. One concerning the distribution of the total profit between rents, wages, and profits. That is a distribution of the available profits. And one typical argument, almost the mainstream arguments, is that because China used to have the fast pace of productive growth of investments and therefore economic growth, thanks to the availability of cheap labor, low labor costs, therefore profitable to invest in labor-intensive production, and therefore the concept in line with the Lewis model, therefore investment. But now China has reached the point of the exhaustion of cheap labor, therefore the unwillingness of capital to invest. That is one possible argument. But this is not necessarily the most convincing explanation, because the slowdown of the economic growth, actually, or slowdown of investments started, in fact, earlier, or at least the profitability declines somewhat earlier, and it's difficult to argue that China reached what's known as the Lewis turning points as early as, say, 2008 or so. And therefore, positive possible alternative explanation is the Lewis turning point in the social rather than demographic sense, the concept of labor militancy for pushing up the wage rate and therefore labor costs. Now, it might well be true to some extent that, say, strikes have become far more common after the 2008. But nevertheless, it is still difficult to believe that systematically the labor militancy has been the main cause. If anything, it's rather the state representing the society as a whole to initiate a wide range of policy measures representing the interests of the labor against capitals. And as we've seen, actually, there's a figure to indicate to you, the wage rate in real terms compared to the productivity. You can see the curve in red is per worker real GDP in real terms. And you can see the very, very fast pace of growth, roughly 8% or so over the period from 2000 to 2022. But incidentally, this is unique in the world that if we look at the global wage report from the ILO, we know that wage stagnation has been the normalcy across the world, both in advanced countries and developing countries. And China has, so the wage growth in China has been an outlier. And then you can see that both the urban wage rate and migrant workers' wage rates have been growing fast, comparable to that of the productivity growth. And of course, as I mentioned, there have been a wide range of initiatives that mostly enforced by the state, minimum wage legislation, labor contract law, the enforcement of the existing labor law, collective bargaining mechanisms being re-established, etc., etc. So possibly this could be an explanation in terms of the distribution of the surplus more to wage rate than to profits. That might be one possible reason. Another possible reason is rather that is the rents squeezing profits, that is speculative activities, in the bubble economies, real estates, stock markets, that squeeze on profitability. So much about the distribution of the surplus between wage, rents, and profit. But that's a further explanation or further set of explanation concerning the declining capability of the economy in the creation of profits. And in this circumstance, two possible explanations. One is the so-called the slowdown of the expansion of demand side, that both the increasing difficulty for China to expand its export to the advanced countries markets, as well as the domestic market, the pace of expansion being not sufficient to compensate for the stagnation in the external fronts. So therefore, we have heard the buzzword about rebalancing, that China, it has been recommended that China need to pop up domestic demands as a compensation for insufficient external demands, and also China need to promote consumption growth as a compensation of in line with the theory of underconsumptionism. So that's one possibility, but it is also possible to claim from economic theory that productivity growth typically is associated with the expansion of the demands, and therefore in the context of demand deficiency, both inside China and on the world scale. No wonder, therefore, that the one dynamism of productivity growth has been diminishing. Another so-called diminishing of the advantages of backwardness, that also seems to be true, right? That major source of technological progress and productivity growth of the Chinese economy over the previous decades has been the ability to import technology and, more importantly, the ability to assimilate and improve upon the imported technology. But now, with China's technological level fast approaching the advanced level, and in particular with the sanctions or restrictions imposed by the advanced countries in terms of technology transfer, the room available for productivity growth through this mechanism has largely diminished. And in fact, one simple indicator is that 20 years ago, the indicator, the indicator of the research and development spending as a ratio of GDP 20 years ago, therefore China was just like 1/3 of the level of OECD countries. By now, that ratio, China's level has substantially exceeded that of the OECD level. So before domestically, indigenously generated productivity growth is sufficient to make up of the loss of dynamism, then we would see this slowdown, the lower, the diminishing capability of creating profits. But all this says, which one explanation seems to be more reasonable than others? And here I would claim and try to in a sense, to prove the point that the financialization of the Chinese economy has been the main problem, right? That is speculative activities crowding out productive activities, in particular crowding out productive investment has been the main cause. Right? One indicator very quickly is that the profit rate of the industrial sector representing the productive sector has not been undergoing the same trend of continuous decline as that of the aggregate profit rates. And then a possible explanation is because an increasingly bigger share of total capital being allocated to speculative activities. And this is also supported by the next graph, that the total financing of the economy. You can see that before the year, say, 2009, we can see that the ratio remains more or less the same. Right. Thereafter, we have the upsurge of this ratio, and of the total financing, the main part being bank loans. There have been many reports of the Chinese banks, including the biggest state-owned banks, have been heavily involved in all kinds of shadow banking activities, under-regulated or unregulated activities, and not to mention all kinds of non-banking financing activities, even more so, in terms of the degree of regulation, much less so. That is an indication of the breakdowns of the line of defense against financialization in China, the separation of commercial banking and investment banking. Right. That's the breakdown, the first line of defense. Actually, another line of defense, external finance, the control over capital flights or hot money coming in or out, that has also been largely undermined. Right. So at the moment, we are witnessing huge capital flights in China, right, because of dollar interest rate rising and also all the propaganda that claim that China is in crisis. Right. pushing capital to move outward. So give me one more minute, right? That this is the possible indication of financialization causing all the problems. Now the one more minute, what I want to talk about is that what happens immediately before the new normal, or to put it another way, what would have happened if there is no financialization? And that is simply indicated by the following table. Right? The year 2000 and 2012, we have seen the fast pace of productivity growth, much faster than before and then after. We have also seen the much fast pace of the growth of both consumption and investments. Now, productivity growth basically comparable to wage growth, and investment growth comparable to consumption growth. Structurally, all these forms a model of development very much similar to the golden age of capitalism before neoliberal globalization. Institutionally, that's also the same. Right? Institutionally, the golden age model is based on big business, economies of scale, right? And in the case of China, the so-called state-owned enterprises advancing, whereas the private enterprises retreating. State-owned enterprises are mainly the big business in China. Right? And secondly, the golden age model also institutionally based on big government, right? That is the government investment in infrastructure, in the technology. Again, in the case of China, it's obvious, right? It's big investment as well as welfare state, the rebuilding of collective consumption, collective welfare, and so on. And finally, big labor, right? In the golden age, again in China, as we have already seen, the wage growth based on the social conditions, right? Minimum wage, collective bargaining, etc. All this should have provided a model of developments similar to the golden age. But now China is combination or the competition between two trains, the golden chains of the golden age and the chain of the neoliberal globalization, both being important components in the Chinese ongoing model of transformation. And therefore, the future prospects for China, by extension, for China's impact on the rest of the world economy depends very much on the rivalry between these two trains. So China seems to be combining the experience of the post-war advanced capitalism, right? That on the one side, the golden age model, on the other side, the neoliberal model being put together into the Chinese economy in conflict to each other. And ultimately, it depends on politics. Right? The golden age model is based on social democratic politics. The neoliberal globalization is based on conservative politics. And again, both being present and very influential in the Chinese political economy nowadays. I think I've overrun my time, so hope this makes sense to you, and I welcome comments.
Even though the first two papers are pretty closely related, I think it'll be useful to have 5 or 6 minutes of 2 or 3 questions, if you can make the questions reasonably precise, to him. So Radhika will be one. And then we'll move on to after that. So Radhika 1, number 2. Is there someone else, Ricardo? Okay, that's be good. Whoops, if we get to 4, Radhika, and make the questions fairly short.
Very short.
We want to do 7 or 8 minutes of this.
Yeah, very short. Thanks, this is really fascinating. Quick question, why is there financialization in China? You said that the growth slowdown is explained, but so can you please explain why you think financialization is taking place, particularly given that financialization is ultimately a policy issue? It only happens if governments permit it to happen. And what is the government aware of this? What do you do about it, etc.?
Great. We'll take 4 questions.
Yeah, sure.
Maybe 3, yeah.
I was just wondering about the idea of measuring this growth in GDP. So I was just curious because the extremely quick growth of China has always seemed like it would inevitably fade. And so I was just wondering whether the slowdown in growth can really be described as a kind of threat for the Chinese economy if it really poses a crisis, because it just seems like it.
Third question, Ricardo, you were third.
Just in terms of what we're seeing here in front of us, I was wondering if the pandemic was a major factor in the fluctuation downward.
And yeah, we will take the 4th one. Yeah, please.
Is it really true that that neoliberal models are simply the result of conservative economic political choice? I mean, is that a sufficient explanation of what's going on in global capitalism?
Okay, so if you could sort of 5 minutes, say something to all them, and then we'll move on.
I think the first and the fourth questions are really closely related. But what have been the driving force behind neoliberalization and therefore financialization? But financialization being the central characteristic of neoliberalism. Now, I haven't had the time to talk about this, but then, elsewhere, I tried to establish an argument that China, in the capitalist world, in particular in the advanced capitalism, but that financialization or neoliberalization has been the result of crisis in the sense of the falling profit rates or the golden age model becoming increasingly unsustainable. Therefore, the turn to the neoliberalism in the way to promote the interest of at least the hegemonic or monopolistic part of capitals. So that's the general trend of the turn from golden age to neoliberalism in the advanced countries. What about China? Now, the claim that China is no less neoliberal or no less capitalistic, the claim or widespread claims tend to say that see neoliberalization also happens in China. That is clear indication that China is no different from the capitalist world. Now, I try to argue that the neoliberalization and also therefore financialization have been mainly externally enforced rather than indigenously, domestically generated. And the main mechanism is that nowadays the Chinese economy is deeply integrated into the world capitalist economy. And in one particularly important aspect, the monetary aspect, the Chinese economy need to rely in a systematic sense on the dollar, the hegemony of the dollar in financing its external activities. The Chinese economy is has its very important part of the economy integrated into the world market, including China's trading relationship with the developing world, that need to be so far still mainly dependent on dollar, despite all the attempts to de-dollarize that have remained mainly the talking rather than the actual situation. And as a result, monetary autonomy has been fundamentally undermined. And there are different symptoms of this, but one symptom is that even in peaceful times, so to say, that is outside the crisis, China, like most other developing countries, have to massively increase their accumulation of official reserves. And China seems to be very extreme. According to the COVID data of IMF, between the year 2000 to 2015 or so, that indicator, the official reserve as the ratio of how many months of payment for imports, the the China's ratio increased from something like 7 months to 21 months, right? And developing countries doubles, right? Roughly from also roughly 7 to 14, right? The advanced countries remain the same, 2 months. That is the indication of the developing countries paying tribute, seniorage, right, to the hegemony dollar. And it's not just the official reserve, but also Chinese citizens holding huge amounts of dollar-denominated financial assets. So as a result, and that's the fundamental cause. And as a result, that China has lost monetary autonomy, and therefore it tries to promote yuan internationalization by means of liberalizing its external finance in the belief that China could become another United States. The renminbi can become a dollar, but it turns out to be a complete disaster, right? That the hegemony of the dollar is not just based on the economy, it's based on military ideology, political forces, and the disaster was witnessed in the year 2015, the Shanghai stock market crash and the yuan depreciation, and behind that, at least $600 billion of capital flight. That is the conservative estimate by the World Bank. So, and of course, I keep saying that it's the external cause, but inevitably you can imagine there must exist a powerful block of vested interest, which in the traditional terminology, the comprado or the parasitic, the speculative capital in China, in particular, represented by the central government, the central bank, right? The governor of the central bank. Again, one minute, right? The governor of the central bank wanted to promote the complete liberalization of the capital accounts, and that was severely criticized, not just by Joseph Stiglitz, but also by the former president of the IMF, Christine Lagarde, in the same conference, 2015. Right? So you can imagine what happened. Okay, very quickly, the other two questions about the GDP growth. Right? Now, not much I can say that the growth, the slowdown of growth, in a sense, seems inevitable, right? Given all the factors I've already mentioned. Right? So I don't have any insights about this. Right? And the disruption caused by the pandemics, actually, it seems quite paradoxical, right? That China massively expanded its exports to the advanced countries, including the United States, during the pandemic, despite all the attempts by Donald Trump and then by Joe Biden to try to decouple. And it's because of the supply chain being built up in the preceding decade, right? Whereby the hollowing out of deindustrialization in the advanced countries, resulting in such dependence on Chinese supply. And that is why this year, the latest figure that has just come out, right, that over the past 8 months, Chinese exports has decreased very, very substantial, right, in particular to the advanced countries. Of course, it's the same as Japan, South Korea, Germany, right? But it's more severe for China because of the resumption of the decoupling, the policies by the advanced capitalist countries. So the pandemic, of course, caused damages to the Chinese economy, but also paradoxically, also provides the supporting, as a supporting factor. Right? So this is quite interesting that we can take note of. Okay, I don't have any additional point. Right?
Okay, thank you very much. Very good.
Yeah, thanks.
We'll move immediately to Meng.
Yeah.
Who's going to present on Mao Zedong and Socialist Institutional Economics. He's from Fudan University.
I have to apologize. I prepared a very slice yesterday, but I'm sorry I forgot to bring with me now. So I just write a new one in a hurry. So I apologize. First, I want to try to introduce the problematic of this article.
You have a background.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. This article is mainly about a reinterpretation of historical materialism, because we want to, by doing this, want to understand how China adopt this very specific path to nowadays we call it socialist market economy. But actually, it's a very long story since the very beginning of the establishment of CCP, or even back to Russia Revolution in 1917. And secondly, in our conclusion, we would like to comment on the so-called basic institutions of socialist market economy, how to interpret this institution, how to understand its significance. So first of all, we would like to go back to the very origin, that is the October Revolution. So first, we would like to comment on Gramsci, because in the aftermath of this revolution, Gramsci wrote a very interesting article which is entitled like this: it's an anti-capital, Das Kapital revolution. But it does not mean Gramsci is against this revolution itself, but only means he finds there is a tension between this revolution and historical materialism. And coincidentally, in 1919, this is a Chinese first generation of CCP's leader. The name is Li Dazhao. So just 2 years after the Russian Revolution, he write an article, and he, in his view, he argues that there is a tension within Marxism itself. So on one side is historical materialism, emphasizing necessity. But on the other hand is the doctrine of class struggle. So according to it, class struggle is the, how to say, the locomotive of historical change. So as I understand now, if there is only a theory of, for example, historical materialism as understood by the Second International, for example, the Russian thinker Plekhanov, there would be no revolution in China because you have to wait. You have to wait the development of forces of production. So Li Dazhao first point out that there is a contradiction between the doctrine of class struggle on the one hand, and on the other hand is the historical materialism. Actually, it is the version of the Second International. And secondly, Li Dazhao also point out that in Marx theory, there's a lack of ethics. Because if you want to initiate a revolution, you have to come up with a revolutionary ethics, which will explain the motivation and the behavior of the revolutionary subject, right? So finally, we come to Lenin, just before his death. So in 1924, he wrote an article. The title is On Russian Revolution. And I coined the word that this can be called the question of late Lenin. Actually, the question including 2 points. First of all, Lenin emphasized that in the whole world history, there is not only necessities, necessary laws, but also contingency. So according to my understanding, Lenin is emphasizing that Russian Revolution actually reflects contingency. So we can say, maybe we can say that all the contribution by Lenin actually is to come up with series of contingencies. For example, the vanguard part theory. The weak point of the Russians, the weak point of the, how to say, the imperialist link, how to say?
Weakest link.
A weakest link. And actually in China, Mao also is a theorist of contingency. He would argue why, for example, I don't know how to do what, to establish the red base, right, within a country of Kuomintang. Why it is possible. So Mao's theory is also a theory about contingency. Okay. We can see from Gramsci to late Lenin, there actually remains a question which is unsolved. If we still adhere to historical materialism, we have to combine, right, the revolutionary practice and the original theory proposed by Marx in the 19th century. So Chairman Mao Zedong in Marx in 1930s, he tried to continue what Lenin has failed to finish, right? Even Lenin leaves us the so-called questions of late Lenin, the two questions. Oh, that's the other, I forgot. The first, what history consists of contingency and necessity? And then Lenin asks the second question, why can we not change superstructure, right? We establish our peasants and workers political regime, and then we catch up with other advanced countries in terms of culture, productive forces, etc. So this is the relation. The beginning, the change begins from superstructure, and then it's changed in relations of production, and finally, it is liberation of forces of production. So this is Lenin's question. But this kind of, so the second point, as Lenin put, actually is the reversal of the traditional understanding of historical materialism, because he put the change in superstructure or the change in relations of production as the, how to say, which becomes the determining factor, right? Formerly, the productive forces, I'm sorry, is the determining factor, right? But Lenin leaves the question unsolved. If we think in this way, what will remain of historical materialism, right? So, so in 1937, and I emphasize here, it is in August. Why the August is important here? Because in July it is in July of 1937, the Chinese-Japanese War break out. So Mao wrote this philosophical essay just 1 month after the breaking out of the war. So people are wondering why Mao writes this. If I say Mao Zedong at that time is writing another essay, which is entitled On the Durable War Against the Japanese, which is most important, another essay, it is understandable. But why Mao at this time writes a purely philosophical essay? But nowadays we can see that it is actually not only a philosophical essay, but also its most attempt to understand what is China's past. Because at that time, China had no chance to pursue a path, for example, like the path of the West. It is unpermittable by imperialism. So you have to choose another one. It is a specific path. Now we call it China's path. So now it leads to the so-called socialist market economy. So socialist market economy actually is a continuation of the China's path as understood by Mao in 1930s. And in 1945, Mao continued his thinking. He, for example, he talking about the machinery role of CCP. He argued that just after the victory of China's war against the Japanese, there is a competition between CCP and the Kuomintang at that time. So there's a possibility to talk about to establish a coalition government, right? Including both CCP and Kuomintang. And Mao argues that how to judge the role of a party, right? It is bad or not. What is the standard? Mao said that the only standard is that whether this party could help liberate forces of production of Chinese people. So I think from 1937 through 1945, Mao's thinking is consistent. And likewise, in the aftermath of the new China, after 1949, Mao's former colleague Liu Shaoqi, right? He wrote an article, argues that the Communist Party, CCP, have two main tasks. We have just finished one. But this is not important. The most important thing is the second task. That is to say, to build up a modernized China. And if we haven't finished the second, the first is not so important. Right. So this is, which proves that this is not the thinking of Mao himself. Actually, it is ideology of the whole CCP. And now we come to late 1950s and to early 1960s. This is the second phase of Mao's thinking. At that time, since that we've already have a communist regime in China, so Mao is concerned with how to build up a socialist economic structure, right? First, we follow the suit of Soviet Union. But in the mid of 1950s, Stalin died and replaced by what's the name? Khrushchev, yeah. So from the mid of 1950s to the early of 1960s, Mao began to critically reflect Soviet political economy. And we all know in 1952, Stalin published his important work on the so-called Soviet socialist economic problem. I'm not sure whether this is the exact English translation.
This is Marginaria on his reading of the Soviet textbook on political economy.
Yeah. And after Stalin's work, the Soviet Union also published a textbook entitled Political Economy, right? Actually, it is an official discourse on socialist economic system, and which is very influential in the 1950s. But from the mid-1950s, Mao began to criticize Soviet political economy, and he writes something, right? Write notebook when he read Stalin and the textbook. Here, I would like to mention only one thing. In Stalin's theory, there is an important law, which we can call it the basic law of socialist economy. So, in this law, we are all experts, we all know that. There's no rule of relations of production. Because what you should do is just increase productive forces to satisfy the need of all the people. That is to say, it assumes the relation of production is perfect, right? There's no need to reform. Mao criticizing this. Mao argues that even public ownership, right, in existing socialism, which can be reformed, which is not perfect. So since the end of the 1950s, in China's academic circle, we can see many professors begins to reformulate Stalin's law, to put institutional change as the very precondition of this law. So since then, I think Mao began to pioneer this, as I coined the word, began to formulate so-called socialist institutional economics. Right. 10 or 15 years earlier, then, for example, new institutionalism, the representative is Douglas North, and also Robert Blanner, regulation approach, and SSA. Okay, now let's talk about two other figures. The first is Li Pingxing, and the other is Zhang Wentian. Li is a academic historian based in Shanghai. But Zhang actually is former colleague of Mao Zedong. He belongs to the first generation of CCP leaders. First, let's look to Li, and Li asked a question. This question has ever been proposed by the Russian thinker Plekhanov. Right? And in 1970s, it is also discussed by the philosopher in Oxford, G.A. Cohen. But actually, well before Cohen, Li talked about this problem. So if there is a contradiction between forces of production, I call it FP, right? And RP, that's contradiction. But you have to confirm FP has an autonomous progress. And when you talk about this, you have to put relations of production aside. So Li, in his essays, research on this problem, and he argues why forces of production can enjoy an autonomous growth before the change of relation of production. So in his view, it is due to the contradiction within forces of production. So he differentiates the technical dimension and also the social dimension of forces of production. Right? Actually, the later refers to division of labor, something like that, or even people's subjectivity. Right? Their revolutionaries exist. Right? And he also argues any change in relations of production have to be compatible to the laws of development of forces of production. Otherwise, it will not succeed. So this is Li. And since Li differentiates forces of production into two subsystems, right, which logically result in Zhang's contribution. Because if you can do this in terms of forces of production, you can also do this with relations of production. So Zhang differentiates two types of relations of production, just as summed up in this table. So we can see that first we have relations of production, RP in general. So mainly refers to relation of division of labor, which represent forces of production directly, even a part of forces of production. Right? And the other is relation of production in specific, which remain serving to appropriate surplus. So if you differentiate these two, right, you can. Since I changed my slides, so can I have a chart? I can write something out of it. Sorry. Yeah, just give me 2 minutes. Oh, okay.
There's a box there.
Maybe box over there.
Oh, here. So in accordance with this, we can have a synthesis, right? We have two systems. So Li and Zhang's contribution is that Li analyzed this subsystem, and Zhang analyzed this. Right? And they have, these two cycles have an intersection. And we call this relation of production, relation of production in general, right? Which means it is not only forces of production, it is also relations of production. So, and this is relations of production, the forces of production. So traditionally, historical materialism is understood like this. Any change in this system, subsystem, will give rise to change in this system. But if you, like Zhang, differentiate two types of RP, you can find that these two types of relations of production can enjoy their own autonomous change. It is possible. So the change can come here. For example, social superstructure, just like Russian Revolution and China's Revolution. So which changes this? And then they want to change this, right? So this is the synthesis we can possibly propose after Li and Zhang. But the origin is Mao and even Lenin. So now let's talk about the relation of this, all this stuff with China's, sorry. Yeah, we can put something here. So what is the basic institution of socialist market economy? So this is contribution of Deng, right? The Deng Xiaoping's contribution. Deng argues that market and the plan, they do not belong to relations in specific. Rather, they belong to RP in general. So as Deng says, there's a famous phrase by Deng. There is plan in capitalism. There is also market in socialism. Right? So which means if it is, for example, if market is considered as relations of production in general, which means it can be combined with relations in specific. So market can be combined with private ownership. It can also be combined with public ownership. So there comes the so-called the basic law. The basic institution, I'm sorry, of socialist market economy. So this institution, basic institution is I can enumerate like this. First, the coexistence of public ownership and private one. Okay. Second, correspondingly the coexistence of distributive relations. Right. Thirdly, in China's official discourse, we call it socialist market mechanism, socialist market economy mechanism. Actually, it means the combination of market and state. So in accordance with this level, we can put, for example, ownership and relations of distribution. Put it here. It is relations of production in specific. And we can put the so-called relation between market and states, because there are two kinds of, there are two modes of coordinating economy, two modes of resources allocation. Right? They belong to here. Right? They belong to here. So then we can see it's probably the one. Correspondingly distribution mode. And here state market. So we can say there are two types of combination. First of all these three, they are combined with each other. These two belongs to traditionally defined relations of production, as we all know. And the so-called socialist market economy mechanism, in my eyes, belongs to Marx's conception, the mode of production, right? Or the mode of organization of social labor, right? These three are combined with each other because there is coexistence between public SOE and private firms. They establish links through markets, right? And even public enterprises, they establish their links also through markets. So I call it vertical combination, right? But the more important thing is that there could be a horizontal combination. Because in every institution, we can see a dualist structure. On the one hand, this is public ownership. On the other hand, it's private one. On the one hand, is distributive relations corresponding to public ownership. And on the other hand is, okay, that. And on the one hand is state. And on the other hand is market. So they combine with each other. And we call this socialist the socialist governance of state. And we call this market mechanism. So China's basic institution of socialist market economy is the organic combination of this. Right? And methodologically, we trace the origin up to Mao to Lenin. Okay, this is my idea. Thank you. Very sorry.
I think you heard at the beginning, he did not bring his notes with him. He had to reconstruct that out of his head while the first speaker was speaking. So that's particularly impressive. He did actually run over during most of the question and answer periods where actually there's a lot of questions. It was more essential that he be able to present his ideas so you'd know what to be able to do. You couldn't ask him questions otherwise. So we're not going to actually have questions on his right now. We're going to move to the other one. He will be here for the rest of the conference. If we're lucky, we'll be able to ask something at the very end. But if not, the question period for him is going to have to come afterwards. And we'll move now to the last section. Oh, is Ricardo here? Ricardo, could you just, when I start, do 20 minutes and then cut me off? Okay. So they'll have to ask the question. It's very important. Again, very impressive that you were able to do that. Thank you. Okay. Okay, where are we here? There we are.
Need to share the screen.
Okay, actually, looks right. Yeah, actually.
This one.
Yeah, anyone works. Yeah, that's good.
This one will be done.
Okay, I wanted to start off with 3 preliminary statements before I get into my talk itself. First of all, I wanted to re-note that this is a combined workshop by the working group Moving Beyond Capitalism, which focuses on what its name suggests, and the China Political Economy Group, which focuses on what its name suggests. The first 2 papers were very much part of the first working group. This is going to be more part of the second working group. Obviously, they're totally related. But this one here will very much be about the question of are markets compatible with the goals of socialism and not per se about China. And that's very important to keep in mind. The second thing I want to say is what I wanted to say is I am going to be saying that markets are possible in socialism. Okay, I'm going to be saying that the idea of a market socialism, in the sense that he was Chinese market socialism, is a possible conception. But I'm also going to be saying, and this will come out in my talk, these are not capitalist markets. These have to be markets different than markets in capitalism. You cannot have capitalist relations in socialism. Okay, that's going to be the argument, and we'll see how much sense it makes. And the third thing that I wanted to say is we really have to separate the two questions. They're obviously related, but are markets possible in socialism? And what role might markets play in the transition to socialism? Including what, separate from that question, what role might even capitalist relations play in the transition to socialism? Capitalist relations, in my view, are not possible in socialism. That does not preclude, in theory, that they might be useful in a transition to socialism. So anyways, that's just a preliminary, and we'll go forward. Okay, background, why am I going to talk about Marx and Engels? Those guys have been dead for a long time. Second of all, what Marx and Engels said about the question of using markets in socialism. The third point, Marx and Engels' broad and fundamental ideas on the goal of socialism, which is, for my mind, and as some of the other speakers have used it, a lower stage of communism. And we'll be using that to consider if socialism could have markets. Fourth will be the issue of using markets in a socialist system of production. Remember, that's in socialism. From the perspective of Marx and Engels' views on the goals of socialism just discussed. And a fifth point, some takeaway points. Okay, so the first point, why talk about Marx and Engels? And so this is my general position, keeping it short because we only have a short piece of time. This is my general view. This is a quote from John Bellamy Foster, which I think is a short way of stating the general concept, which you could state any number of ways. Marxism has been, since its conception in the mid-19th century, the primary basis of the critique of capitalist society. So that's by John Bellamy Foster. The particular quote is by the first reference there, The Return of the Dialectics of Nature. Gives the page number and everything. There's two other works that were also in monthly review that came out at the beginning of this year that I think are very interesting for thinking about ideas on Marxism, whether you agree with them all or not, thinking about them. And so I've just included them as references to think about some of these questions.
The last one is a really good article.
Yeah,
New Rationalism.
Thank you. Yeah, I planted him in the audience thinking it was important. Okay, background, what Marx and Engels said about using markets in socialism. The extremely short answer is Marx and Engels did not directly write almost anything about the issue of the use of markets in socialism, okay? So they didn't write anything fundamentally. Now, to be very clear, Marx and Engels, of course, wrote a great amount about the evils of markets as part of capitalism. But that was fundamentally all as part of their attack on capitalism. So although exploitation does not take place in the markets, and that's something to remember, you know, even in capitalism, it's not markets where exploitation takes place. Marx went to great extent to write about that. Markets in capitalism do function in accord with how markets there need to function to achieve capitalism's purpose, the appropriation of surplus labor for the self-expansion of capital. But this has nothing to do with socialism or how it could function to meet the goals of socialism, okay? Okay, so Marx and Engels, I wish I could move this thing here. Fundamental ideas on the goals of socialism, which we're going to use to see if markets, that's going to be the judgment thing, to see whether markets are precluded from socialism. We have to know what socialism is trying to do, so we see whether markets prevent it from doing that. So we'll talk about the goals of socialism, and then we'll just very quickly talk about the goal of socialism, just as another way of talking about the goals of socialism. So we're not going to spend long on these. Uh-oh, I just lost my, oops, I did. Okay, now I can advance. Okay. So these are well known, we'll go through them quickly, but we can talk about broad goals of socialism. So liberty or freedom, and Marx and Engels use these terms a lot. People collectively being the subjects of their own history, controlling their own fate, being the masters of their own fate. Society collectively controlling all its own institutions, collectively working together. Social self-determination, self-governance, socialist democracy. These are all terms for getting at the same things, various goals of socialism. The elimination of exploitation. No one is able to appropriate the products of the labor of other people. No one is able to live off the labor of other people, which of course is what all class societies have been about. environmental and ecological sustainability, meaningful work, work that supports and develops workers' potential, humanity, and one could come up with others. Okay, I'm just trying to give an idea. You need to talk about what the goals of socialism are if you're going to ask the question, do markets prevent us achieving socialism? And we can talk about specific goals of socialism as well. When people talk about goals, sometimes they're talking broad general, sometimes they're talking very specific, concrete, universal health care, universal free education, abolition of child labor, humanly dignified housing, social control of production, comprehensive social security, and on, okay? So those are all laundry list, a smorgasbord of goals of socialism. Now, I just want to very briefly say, people very often, I do this very often, many people do it as well, talk about the goal of socialism. And I like to talk about the goal of socialism as being human development, and then all these other goals obtain their significance as goals in the way that they contribute to that central goal of human development. It's just a way of talking about it. It's not necessarily the only way of doing it. And if you're going to talk about the goal of socialism, it doesn't have to be said as human development. There's other ways of getting at that same idea. And so different people use different words in the literature. And so we should be very careful to try to look at what they're actually saying and not the particular words they use. Other things that fundamentally mean the same thing: development of humans' potential, both individual and collective. Development of humans' abilities and capabilities. And that, of course, gets very close to the ideas of Nussbaum and Sen. Becoming more fully human, or to support and promote the collective self-development of humans, of their potential to be more human. Okay, so we've established some goals, and now we can ask the question, do markets prevent us from achieving the goal of socialism? So this is the issue of using markets in a socialist system of production from the perspective of Marx and Engels' views on the goals of socialism just discussed. Okay, the first question is, what is a market? And people automatically, when they think about a market, they think about a market as they see it in a capitalist society. And what I'm saying is a market, you look it up in the dictionary, but what is a market? It's where you exchange things which are considered equal for some reason. That's what a market is. And making that more concrete, and I mean, so it's historically concrete, not just a question of looking in a dictionary. Markets have existed in every single mode of production, every single complex mode of production. There's some very simple ones that don't. And, you know, in the 20th century, one of the myths sort of was that markets were only generalized under capitalism. They only played a fundamental role in capitalism. And that's just been shown historically wrong by people that do historical and anthropological research. Markets were fundamental to the way feudalism operated. They weren't the only thing. There was a direct appropriation, we know that, but they were a fundamental part too. They were fundamental to the Roman society, the Athenian society, to Egypt. They were recorded back in Sumer in 2000 BC. Sumer went back to 3000, but they were recorded in 2000 BC. So they existed in all these complex things. So that's just one thing. And that brings up the idea that we could have a different type of market in socialism than capitalism, because capitalist markets are already a different type of market than they were in different modes of production. Along those lines, this is just a pet peeve of mine, my general anger at the capitalists that rule the world. But anyways, confusing different terms, markets versus capitalist markets. And that's very often used, but they talk about them as if they were equal. So again, the correct statement that capitalism requires markets is not logically equivalent to the incorrect statement that the existence of markets determines or even implies capitalism. There's been markets in other systems, but capitalism needs markets, and it needs them to be capitalist market or markets that operate in the capitalist mode of production. The serious political issue in the sense of changing the world is the hegemonic misuse of the term market economy as a synonym for capitalist economy. Everybody uses that, both the capitalists and the left. They just use the words market economy to mean capitalist economy. That shouldn't be done, but I won't. I don't control the dictionary, so that's all that. Okay, are markets inconsistent with Marx and Engels' concept of socialism? That's the question we're asking. Including the, in particular, this is the one thing I want to ask in particular, because it seems like they might be, with the social planning necessary for socialism. One of the goals of socialism is to have a system where human beings collectively decide what they want and then produce it. They socially control their own institutions. They socially plan. social planning is essential for socialism. I'm not going to argue that at length, but that's one of my presuppositions. Comprehensive social planning. So anyways, socialism with markets versus market socialism. Okay, this is part of the confusion. Okay, I'm going to say market socialism contradicts Marx and Engels' goals of ending exploitation. And there I have to be careful, because even with the word market socialism, you have to say, what are you talking about? Now, when I'm talking about it right here in this theoretical talk, I'm talking about the ideas in practice of Alex Nove and those people. I'm talking about the theoretical ideas of Romer and Bardin and all the people in the 90s that had those models. That's not necessarily the same way the Chinese are using the term market socialism. I have serious questions whether market socialism, as the Chinese are using the term, is theoretically the same as those things. And I could talk about that why, but I'm not gonna. But I'm not talking about China right now. I'm talking about the theoretical idea of market socialism in the sense, in the West and in the North, of Alex Nove and Bardin and Romer and all the theoretical people. Okay, so market socialism contradicts the goal. And why does it? Because there is, you have exploitation, you have circuits of capital, all those things exist in those models. Exactly one of the goals of Marxism, we said, is no exploitation, nobody living off other people. Those exist. Those are basically left social democratic redistribution models. There's some exploitation and you redistribute by tax. So anyways, my claim is that market socialism does contradict, even though I'm going to say you can have socialism with markets, I'm going to say market socialism in the sense of those people is not possible, not in socialism. However, and then I want to talk about self-employment, because of course I work a lot on Cuba and everything. We really have to separate self-employment from market socialism, because self-employment requires markets. But self-employment is not market socialism. Self-employment does not involve any exploitation of anyone else. You're not hiring any other labor. There's nobody. We can talk about self-exploitation, but that's something else. Okay, it may not be a good system. It may not be what I'm advocating, but it doesn't. Self-employment is not market socialism. Self-employment is not market socialism. And so therefore, even in Cuba, they're worried about this when they got up to, a tenth of the workforce being self-employed. Does that mean we're not building socialism? That's not a break on, so it may not be what you want in socialism, but it doesn't contradict the goals of socialism of no exploitation. Okay, conclusion and takeaway points 1 through 3. Marx and Engels did not directly write almost anything about the issue of the use of markets in socialism. Ricardo, how am I doing? 5 more? Okay, I think I'll do it. The word markets is not a synonym for capitalist markets, what I said before. The term market economy is not a synonym for capitalist economy. Now, the central conclusion of this presentation, there's nothing contradictory in using markets as tools in a socially planned economy. They decide what they want to do, and this is just one tool. I don't even say you have to use markets. I don't even say markets are more efficient. I actually totally believe we could have a materials balance system that the Russians tried to do. I believe we have the technology to do that, but that's not what people in the world are experimenting right now. So that's interesting to write about, but I'm looking at, are the Vietnamese, are the Chinese, are the Cubans, are what they're doing impossible because of, okay. So, there's nothing contradictory in using markets as tools in a socially planned economy for some economic interactions with the concept of socialism of Marx and Engels. Okay, 4th conclusion. Now this is a secondary conclusion for the paper. That was the first one. The 20th century market socialism hybrid of capitalism and socialism, a la Alex Nove and many others, is not consistent with Marx and Engels' concept of socialism, because the contradiction with Marx and Engels' concept of socialism, that it allows some people to live off the labor of others, contradicting it. And then this will be my last point. Now I'm jumping from socialism to getting to socialism. So this is a different discussion. Market socialism and the constructive socialism, this will be my last slide. It's logically incorrect to conclude that the inconsistency of market socialism, I've said it's not consistent, with the concept of socialism in Marx and Engels determines that it's inappropriate it's an inappropriate economic system to construct socialism. And to support this, we have the well-known difference between means and ends. Now, we're not saying they're not related. We know they are, but we also know that they're not the same thing. And The third point, using means that contradict the goal to achieve the goal is very common in regular life. One idea that's universally accepted, and of course it's abused by governments, but it's universally accepted, is that we can use war to make our society safe for peace. Now, of course, they use it because they're lying and stuff. But anyways, that's not the point. I mean, the concept that you might have to fight a war to establish peace is actually broadly socially accepted and is very, very reasonable. So the idea that, you know, to get to something, you can only use things which are consistent with being there is not true. You might have to use something and suppress it. In Marxist theory, we have that for the state. You've got to use the state strongly in the transition in order to suppress the state in the final thing. So that's just a concept to make sure that we don't get confused there. And so using means contradictory to the ends logically implies, but it does mean, and this you have to do it, if you're going to use the state to get to the end of no state, some point you've got to start getting rid of the state. If you're going to use war to achieve peace, sometime you've got to stop fighting the war, or else you're not going to have peace. So that has to be kept in mind too. It's not like, okay, we can use it forever. No, you're not going to get there if you use it forever. And so the last thing I'll just say, and I'll leave it as a question, I'll say all these ideas can then be thought about in relation to the question of China, Vietnam, and Cuba. Cuba is the one that I study the most, but I really want to understand those three countries are very different in the role that the markets play in their societies. And so if you don't talk about markets in the process of building socialism in China, Vietnam, and Cuba, because they're very different. That's it. We could take maybe, I mean, I'll almost ask for 5 minutes of questions, because I'd really like to get back to a few questions on him too. But anyways, yeah. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we'll stop. And then if you had any time left, we'll get a couple of questions in for him. Yes, please, one.
You wrote a paper I read for IIPPE a few years back about worker cooperatives. You use Madrigon,
yep,
et cetera. You're including Madrigon,
yep,
within the worker cooperatives within the scheme work as fitting within Marx and Engels, correct?
So let me just do that real quickly, because I can do that and not have to come back to it, because I'll forget it because I'm getting old. Yeah, I just forgot. Workers' co-ops is very much a transitional question. So most of the paper was about in socialism itself. So the question is, Mondragon is a question of, can co-ops be used to overcome capitalism? And that's actually what my talk in the last session was about. Can co-ops be used to build socialism and stuff like that? But the answer is, there's a debate about that. Some people see so my answer is no. Workers' co-ops will never get us to socialism by themselves. Some people then think of workers' co-ops as a trap that will take people and sidetrack them from the fight for socialism. I think workers' co-ops are something which teach something about cooperativism, getting us above the isolated individual, just like unions do, to a broader view. So I think they are helpful, but that is the question of the transition to socialism and not the question of in socialism. Finally, on co-ops, in socialism, I consider cooperatives, as they would be in socialism, which is not as they are in capitalism, to be nothing different than the associated producers that Marx and Engels have. Those are co-ops in socialism to me.
Because you have a problem with degeneration and
yeah, absolutely. That's the question of getting there. Yeah, and Marx and Engels wrote about the positive and the negative of co-ops for those reasons. Yes. 2, Radhika.
Yeah, I just want to know very quickly what you mean by capitalist markets and how they are different from other markets.
Yeah. Okay, capitalist markets. Let me leave that. Third one. I see more hands than I saw before. Who did I call 3 and 4 before? Who was number 3 before? Was it Alan or not? Okay, Alan, you can go for it.
But I may be wrong.
Yeah, maybe you're wrong.
Is there going to be discussion at the end of this, or is this it?
This is it. I mean, this is it.
Okay,
this is it.
Very quick.
Yeah.
I
mean, we have 15 minutes left in the session. We have a long brunch. We can go 5 or 10 minutes over.
I agree in general, the whole thing. But I would question when you say that Marx and Engels do not mention markets. Actually, I think they indirectly mention them by not mentioning them.
Okay, but just before you go on, I didn't say that. I said they didn't mention them in socialism. I said they wrote extensively about markets and
I
capitalism.
just want to read very briefly a quote from this manifesto, which is relevant to my J's.
Yeah.
The first step in the revolution by the working class is to raise the proletariat to the position of ruling class. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest by degree all capital from the bourgeoisie, centralize the instruments of production in the hands of the state, and increase productive forces as rapidly as possible. Of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads into the rights of property, and on the conditions of bourgeois production by means of measures which appear economically insufficient and untenable, but in the course of movement outstrip themselves, necessitate further on-road in the old social order, and unavoidable as a means of revolutionizing the production mode of production. Same in the critique of Gotha program.
Yep.
The emphasis is on property. So I would say that I wouldn't even contrast markets and capitalism. Their central focus is property and what property actually means. And despotic inroads doesn't necessarily mean you replace them, which is relevant to Dick Lowe, because the point is there are two ways of thinking about capitalists to do it. Tell the capitalists to do it.
Okay.
So I think both are compatible with the Communist Manifesto, and I therefore see no contradiction between what you're saying and the Communist Manifesto. I think it's all in the manifesto.
Oh yeah, everything I say is in the manifesto. I agree with that.
I have been wrong about some things.
No. Yeah, right. That's fine. So I'm going to answer that. I'm still holding Radicus for a minute, but that actually relates to it. That's the question of what I mean by capitalist markets. So first of all, you're talking about what they're talking about there is the transition, okay? And I was talking mostly about in socialism and not the other stuff. So that's actually a discussion of in the transition. They weren't actually talking about markets there. They were talking about property rights. And property rights are fundamental in some sense, much more actually in all senses, much more fundamental to markets, but that's not what I'm talking about here. So we're in agreement. There's no difference. And of course, I'm in agreement with Communist Manifesto because I never say anything different than Communist Manifesto. Next point. Who was the next point? Now we see more hands all the time. Let's get Dick Lowe.
I'm Satoshi Matsui from Japan.
I'm Satoshi.
Two questions. You said self-employment requires market. Why does it require market? Do you think self-employment without market impossible? I think it's impossible. I think it's possible. And second, if socialism with market does not contradict idea of socialism, why do you have to go to final goal, socialism without market?
Okay, so I'm still holding, I'm not forgetting Radika's question, but I am going to take this one up too, because I can more or less say this. Self-employment, any idea that we have of a broad spread, instead of self-employment, we call it petty commodity production. Any economy that had a real broad sector that was doing petty commodity production, they all produce little things. They have to exchange them somehow. Could it possibly be done differently? Yeah, you could actually have a planning agency that had direct exchange processes. I believe the technology exists for that. It could be done. But we haven't seen anything like that. People aren't even writing about that or stuff like that. But yes, it could be theoretically done. But right now, in Cuba, if you want to allow petty commodity production, a bunch of people just producing things themselves, then you got to have markets, or you can't have that sector of the economy. And this is important politically because people keep confusing the issue of when petty commodity production expanded in Cuba. Did that mean the reestablishment of capitalism? Now, it might be good and it might be bad, but it doesn't mean the reestablishment of capitalism. Capitalism cannot exist on petty commodity production. That's why, of course, capital didn't even exist in the first 3 chapters of Capital. That capital wasn't even existed. After that, the first 3 chapters discussed a petty commodity production theoretical society, which didn't exist in real society. But anyways, okay, that's that. And the answer is, if you chose to have socialism with markets, which I say is possible, why does that mean you'd have to give that up and go to the other thing? So from my theoretical point of view here, all I'm saying is what's important to socialism is that human beings collectively decide what they want to do, and then they go about and do it, and they decide how it's going to be distributed. That's the Enlightenment idea of, you know, human beings having control of their own social mechanism. And so the answer is, it doesn't require it at all. I'm not saying that. I say you could have socialism with markets as a tool inside of a socially conceived plan, and that wouldn't be a violation. But I also want to say, because some people think markets are necessary for some reason, I also want to say I personally believe you could have the old Soviet system of material balances done properly with modern technology and not distorted by the political distortions which existed in the Soviet Union, and you could also do that. So I'm not saying markets, some people that are for market socialism say markets are better because they're more efficient and stuff like that, and I consider all that garbage. So it could be done with markets, but it could also be done without markets. That's my argument. Let me actually, before I don't answer it, what do I mean by market socialism? And then I can ask maybe one more question.
What about my question?
I know, that's what I meant to hear. By capitalist markets, that's what I meant to say. The words came out wrong. There's really no such thing as a capitalist market. So there is a market within, well, for me, the most important thing about capitalism is circuits of capital.
No, but you keep saying that we need markets, but not necessarily capitalism.
I know, and that's actually a misphrase. Okay, so there is no such thing as a market is a general term, and it acquires its characteristics. So it's fundamentally wrong, but I always run over anyways, and every time if I have to pause and explain, maybe I should do that. Just write capitalism in a market setting. Maybe I should be clear. That's a good point. So again, to be clear on this, there's no such thing as a market. Markets are just where you exchange things which are conceived of as equal by some reason. We think of it as labor, whatever the reason is. That's what a market is. And markets inside of a capitalist mode of production do what markets there have to do, including all the things which Marx wrote about with distorting humanity and stuff like that. So they're not just these neutral things. They do some amazing things inside, but they do that as part of that system. That's all I meant to say. Yeah. Yep.
Thank you, Al. Thank you for all the presentations. This question is for Al. I think socialism, what the definition that you use in your slide, I think we understand that cannot be achieved within one single country. So it is actually a world global system. And having markets in countries that have had socialist revolutions, I think it's also a means of survival, because the prospect of having revolution, socialist revolution in the advanced economies are so remote. What do you want them to do in the meantime? What can they do? They probably would also understand, agree that market socialism will not lead to ultimately the socialism that we all want. But in the meantime, they need to survive. Take Cuba, for example. After the collapse of Soviet Union, they lost their biggest trading partner. What could they do with all the sugarcane, but they cannot buy it from anything else? So they need the market to survive. So they need to learn how to play this game in order to survive. So that is just my comment. It is actually maybe reflecting what Radka has already said before, that the failure of the left in the West maybe is the main cause for like all these overall questions that we did.
So I just want to respond to that real quickly. You know, Sam Key, of course, has her feet on the ground. And so she's talking about the real world instead of my head in the clouds, talking about these theoretical different ideas and everything. But, you know, what I'm talking about is what is possible. And separate from that is that every country is going to have to figure out how to get to socialism, and actually they'll have slightly different ideas of socialism themselves that they're going to, but they're going to have to figure out how to do it themselves. And they're going to have to do it on the basis of their own history that got them to where they are today. But in line with what she said, I'll repeat what I said before to try to underline it. Not only so markets are possible in socialism, and so a priori, they're possible in the transition to socialism. I argue that capitalist relations, now I'm going to mention a real world country, I'm going to mention China, about what Sam Key and a lot of other people know more than me. China is obviously using capitalist relations of production in its attempt to build socialism. Okay, is that possible? I've argued it is. I've argued it's theoretically possible. right here, I'm not going to argue whether China's doing it right or doing it wrong, partly because I don't know much about it compared to a lot of other people in this room, though that doesn't usually stop me from talking about things. But anyways, so in line with Sam Key's point, if China thinks, and hopefully if they're right, that they need, this is not markets, this is actually something beyond that. Capitalist relations of production is something they need, and we all know why, to build up the forces of production and stuff like that in the world in which it exists today. If they think that's the way to socialism, maybe they're right and maybe they're wrong, but there's no theoretically thing wrong with using something which is contradictory to your goals to get there. And so, to my mind, you know, I'm watching China to see how successful they are in it. We all know the dangers, incidentally, of it. And to be real frank and blunt, as far as I'm concerned, as long as there's a really clear leadership supported by the people that's taking the whole society in the right direction, you can use means of production, you can use means to get to a goal that are contradictory to that, and you can turn it around at the end. The real danger is the corruption that can come from those forces. It can cause the people that actually have power to be more in favor of, at some point, giving up that goal and going to a different goal. That's my view on that. Let me just tell you a couple of people. I know you want to eradicate, but
no, I'm hoping that we go back to the general session discussion, because I have another question for Dick Hill.
Yeah, well, we didn't even give him any questions yet. I guess technically we have like 4 minutes left. What I would really like to do is actually stop. I'll talk to you guys afterwards individually. I'd like to stop and just see if we have any questions for our second speaker. Do you have a question for the second speaker? Oh, good. You're a good man. You got questions for everybody. Go for it.
A question prompted by the first two presentations on China.
I'm sorry, a question what?
My question is prompted by the first two presentations.
Yeah.
It's about the importance of finance, money.
We're talking, this is to him.
And the importance of financialization in the current Chinese economy. So in the institutions of socialism with markets in the Chinese case, to what extent has there been a debate in China about banking and about shareholding? So my general question would be, in a future socialist society, what would happen to finance, the institution of banking? And then we can relate it back to the property ownership question, the question of the stock market in order to raise finance. Where is the investment going to come from via the institution of money, institution of the stock market, and the institution of banks?
Okay, so in some sense, at the end, you reformulated that in a general way, which would have put it toward me, but I'm not going to answer it. We're going to turn it over to you. Did you understand the question? What would be the role of finance and bank? So you'd be talking about your vision of what maybe you and Dick together could talk about that, and we'll end on that.
You mentioned the manifesto, right? Well, I also cite manifesto, and I think China practice what the manifesto has said. The working class, after the working class got the political power, you have to do several things. First, you have, how to say, got the top banking sector become, how to say,
nationalize the banks.
Secondly, you have to nationalize land, right? And thirdly, Marx mentions is transportation. I understand is actually strategic and basic industry should be controlled by that country. Right? China practice all this. This is why I still think China is still socialism.
Dick, did you want to say something on that too?
I'm sorry, I don't have any view, on the role of finance in socialism and in the process of constructing socialism. My mind is on the existing world, and I haven't thought about it.
Okay. I think actually we will stop right there because we can obviously go on. I will be available to talk to everyone afterwards. I'm sure these two will as well at lunchtime and everything. But it is the time, and that's sort of a break. And I think we'll stop there if that's all right. Okay.
right now.
Yeah, I know I am.
It's what David required. It's what exchange.